You may notice this is a little bit more stripped down from what we normally do as an episode 0. We don't really have the visuals and everything, and I don't really know how I feel about using the old stuff from Mr. Video Games. So we're going to do this episode 0, a little bit of a basic bare bones version, just to get an idea of the flow and feel. Any feedback, any constructive criticism on this would be really appreciated by the both of us. This is a project me and Brian Wonderboy are working on, and if people like it, we're going to do more episodes of this. We're going to be looking into making this the best experience for you guys. Do you want to say hey here, Brian?
Of course. I'm always welcome to say hello. Hi, welcome to Thought W. I'm sorry. That is the limit of my crassness for this show because there's some reverence going into this. This, of course, looking at the history of an art form that is so near and dear to both of us in video gaming. So I'm excited about this. I know that this is something that you've been trying to get off the ground for years at this point,
Yeah.
and I'm not gonna lie, like whenever you threw it out there, like, hey, who wants to help? Like I jumped at the bit. This is stuff like this is super interesting to me. I don't necessarily know everything that you do. I think you have a bit more about this than I do, even though like you, I'm a research hound.
Mhm.
So like this has been really fun already to look into, and I am very excited to play a pseudo audience surrogate in some ways, while also helping to travel through this wonderful journey.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I do want everyone to know here. I know a fair amount about this, if just because this is kind of like old tech is one of my favorite things, just in the absolute world. So I've read a lot about old tech, if just because that's part of the job market that I'm in as well. Just as everything else. So, yeah, anyway, let's get into the actual meat and potatoes here. Today, we're going to be talking about a man that really only in the last 10 years has really gotten his comeuppance as being what you could honestly say as the founder of the what we consider a modern video game console. Of course, people talk about Ralph Baer, and rightfully so, from the Magnavox Odyssey that we're about to get into to give you some backstory first, as the first console. But I would argue the Fairchild F was the first real console for several reasons. We had predecessors, but this is a toy. And don't get me wrong, Ralph Baer made something great in this toy, but it's not what you would consider a video game console. Uh, Go ahead.
No, not at all. I was just saying no, not at all. Like especially in terms of like even the most rudimentary understanding of what a video game console is. Like this is basically the most bare bones that you could get for something you plug into a TV.
Yeah. At the time, Ralph Baer worked for Magnavox, and they were trying to find ways to get the TV to go into more houses, to make it more exciting. And Ralph Baer, and we'll go into this more later as well. There's going to be a whole episode on the Magnavox Odyssey because there's a lot to talk about that we can't cover in the 5 minutes that we're going to talk about the Magnavox Odyssey here. But he basically scribbled down his idea on a sheet of notepaper and handed it to his boss one day randomly. Like, here's my idea for a way you can interact with your TV, and this is how we'll sell more TVs. And ultimately, it ended up in the Magnavox Odyssey with this weird little controller thing with all of these strange knobs that let you move around. At most, it's a blank screen with 3 white dots on it. You and a player 2 can control 2 dots on the screen, And how you interact with the single dot that is also on the screen depends upon the cartridge you enter. The cartridge has no real memory, no real programming. It is just altering the way that you are interacting with the signal that is going to the television. And that is the
Yeah,
brown
it's just,
box.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just saying, like, yeah, like the, a lot of people when they point to the Odyssey, they look at the cards that come with it as cartridges in some ways, when in actuality they're just basically pin connectors that signal different movements or different like control schemes to the dots that are on the screen. Like it's not anywhere near what you would traditionally think of a video game cartridge doing in terms of interacting with the hardware of the console itself.
Yeah, it's such a bizarre little novelty, and even getting to this point, because Ralph Baer was an engineer. He didn't care about, this sort of thing, but his company Sanders that he actually worked for before Magnavox asked to help with getting TVs off the ground was a defense contractor. So if we didn't have defense contracting in the United States, we might not have had the Magnavox Odyssey. It's such a bizarre little world where all of these things come out of. And my favorite thing about the Magnavox Odyssey, bar none, is that good old Blue Eyes, Frank Sinatra, tried to promote this product. He was a huge futurist and thought this would revolutionize the world, and nobody really saw that.
That's interesting that Sinatra saw this because, like, let's be real, like the Odyssey might not have been the thing to do it, but what the Odyssey was trying to accomplish definitely uh, took over the world in a way. So Sinatra is a visionary, I
Yeah,
guess.
and also the most realistic light gun to have ever existed.
Jesus Christ, yes, that thing was like a fucking buckshot in it.
uh, yeah, it was cool, I guess, but most people, let me explain for the Odyssey. You would put a little screen on your television, and that would be how you interacted with your world through it. And one of the games that they had for the Magnavox Odyssey that was the one that kind of got the most interest out of it was table tennis, ultimately the predecessor to Pong, which we kind of have to go through Pong as well to get to the Fairchild, because Pong was hugely inspired by the Magnavox Odyssey and that game. Even the table tennis game that is on the Magnavox Odyssey, you can track that back to a game that was made on an oscilloscope to get people interested in hardware called Tennis for Two. Just this
Ah, yes.
little oscilloscope game where a little dot booped and beeped on both sides, and that was the inspiration for Ralph Baer to make that game. And then came Atari. Atari failed with their first outing. A game that was originally made in, I want to say it was MIT. I might be wrong on that fact, but we'll get back to this later and I'll have my facts straight for that, was computer space. And let me find a picture of that actually, because that cabinet is out of this world. And I don't mean that as a pun, it is fucking crazy.
No, the cabinet for computer space is one of the most like ingenious and odd looking things, and I want one just to put. So I would never actually put it anywhere in my house because it would take up too much space. But like just the sheer design of it, like it's a work of art.
Look at that monstrosity. Going from pinball to this guy here is genuinely amazing. That this is eventually what you got as what you first released when you're like, hey, we want to invite people to play games and put them in front of this massive cabinet with all of these strange buttons that looks futuristic. It is daunting. So it is no surprise that after that, Atari went, okay, what else can we do? Now, Pong first came out because Nolan Bushnell was talking to one of his programmers that he had recently hired, and okay, as an exercise, I want you to make table tennis. And the version of table tennis the guy made was so good, he decided, no, this is going to be what we promote. And if Nolan Bushnell was good at anything, it was promoting and selling. Whenever we get around to Atari, the amount of money that Atari had in the 70s is crazy. They were massive. The fact that 1983 destroyed Atari is such a bizarre thing after how big they got. I mean, I guess you compare it in our lifetimes to like pets.com, how it was
Oh yeah,
everywhere.
the tech bubble. Yeah,
Yeah,
the internet bubble, the I think early aughts. Yeah.
yeah, you can think of Atari as like having if Amazon had fallen through and completely
Hmm.
blown apart.
Deft comparison.
Yeah, in fact, the first day that Pong was released as a standalone arcade game, um, it was put into a bar and it died the first day, not because anything bad happened with the machine. So many quarters were put into this machine in one day that it overflooded the coin reservoir on day one. To say Pong was a success is selling it short. Pong was one of the biggest successes in gaming of all time. There was even a home console of Pong that Atari made, and then other companies said, hmm, that's a nice little console you have. We have it too. um, and yet again, we could do a whole episode on Pong consoles alone. Pong consoles actually
Sure
were
we will.
how
I'm sure we will.
it was how Nintendo got into the electronic gaming space.
Hmm.
Oddly enough, um,
Interesting.
and whenever we talk about Pong as well, I feel like I'm setting up way too much. Ralph Baer used to have a
Oh no,
really
no.
good website. I got a lot of my old data on how the arcade space and gaming in the 70s went by a lot of the stuff Ralph Baer wrote himself. Um, this was the disclosure document for the Let's Play television games prototype that he put out. It looks like the most boring thing in the world. But here it
Who
is.
would have thought? But who would have thought like this little like this tattered piece of paper would have spawned an entire like $1 billion industry at this point?
Yeah, it was 4-page document that he just kind of sprawled on his desk one day. That was his proposal for his next $1 million idea. Um, and of course, there were all sorts of little things going on here. For your knowledge, this is about what the Magnavox Odyssey looked like. You got dots, you move the dots. But eventually there was a lawsuit, and the lawsuit ripped the gaming industry that existed at the time apart because Magnavox started suing everyone left, right, and center over this because hey, we made a game first. We've got the patent, this 4 sheets of paper here that was written out by some dude for how you can interact with the TV. Atari did eventually win the lawsuit, saying that the way that they were interacting was not the same way that he was interacting, and that Pong was substantially different enough, having a score and several other things for the interaction system, that there was actually a true AI at play rather than just how the pins were interacting, that they were able to win the lawsuit. But that also was what allowed the flood of market that became the Pong consoles.
Yeah, every major toy company, and I think every major electronics company in the country had their own version of Pong available for household play, which is crazy to think of. Like some of the just the sheer amount of companies that just flooded the marketplace with that.
And just to show my research here, this bad boy is the first real Atari Pong console for home market. So, all that said, we told that story to tell you the story of a man by the name of Jerry Lawson.
Big Jerry.
Yeah, spoilers, he is no longer with us. Oh, the New York Times, you cannot view in private mode. I forgot about that little hiccup. That hiccup that I've had several times. I will just read from it on my own then. Um, in the browser
Yeah.
window, I'm actually logged in. It's not that important. Uh, but Jerry Lawson himself was a large man in the industry in the mid 70s. And by large, I mean in the literal sense. He was 6'6". He was loud, he was boisterous, and he was, without a single doubt in the world, an OG nerd. If you consider nerds at the time, this guy was it. His mother, uh, actually, am I still here? Brian? Did my internet die?
I can still hear you.